But thank you for coming. This is just an optional talk. It's kind of the back end of our Darwin Day event. We've had such a great Darwin Day. We've had our special guest, Dr. Graves, who for some reason wanted to come and listen to me. But maybe he'll chime in as well here as we move forward as a religious scientist as well. So what I want to do, the way I like to do this, is I do about a half an hour, just kind of an introduction, kind of lay some stuff down, okay? And so you get to know me and know where I'm coming from. And then it's just question and answer. And I stay here as long as people want to ask questions. So start thinking about what questions you might want to ask. But let me lay down just a few things in my introductory remarks. Well, first, my story. So I was born and raised Latter-day Saint. My dad was a business major at BYU. Some of the older crowd may know Steve Ogden Carpets. That's my dad. If you know him from football at BYU, then you're really special. And my mom did a 2-year associates, and then she was a stay-at-home mom until she went back to school at the age of 68 and graduated with her bachelor's degree. So there we are, lifting my mom up with all my siblings. I grew up essentially in a household where, even though my parents weren't like really into this, but I grew up kind of a creationist, thinking that there was a deity who created special creation acts for the diversity of life. But again, we didn't really think much about it. But if I think back to what was my position at the time, that's what my position would have been at the time. Most of that came not from my parents or anything. It mostly came from here, LDS youth take seminary, right? Religious studies during school, or even institute. And so that's where I got most of my foundation, because that's where I would read things that were really anti-science, anti-evolution. And then, as all good young Latter-day Saints, I went and served a mission in Chile for 2 years. Así que hablo español si quiere hablarme en español. And I was doing a BS in zoology at BYU, interrupted for the 2 years, went back to BYU, finished my zoology degree. But in the meantime, I went back to Chile just to visit people that I had met, and ended up meeting my wife, and she's Chilean. And then so I finished my bachelor's degree, and then I moved to Chile to do a master's degree in zoology while my wife was finishing her degree in medicine. Then we decided after that, and after having one daughter in Chile, we moved back to the States, and I did a PhD in biology with Michael Whiting, who was here earlier. He's the director of the Being Life Science Museum right now at BYU. So I have one wife only, MD, and 4 kids. Sometimes you have to clarify that. And one of them is a BYU student. My second is doing her mission actually right now in the same place where I served my mission in Chile, but she comes home a week from yesterday. So I'm on 6-day countdown that she comes home. And then I've got a younger girl, a daughter in high school, another child in middle school. Okay, so that's a kind of a quick rundown on who I am and kind of where I'm at. Oh, and also I'm an LDS bishop right now, have been for almost 6 years. Here's a picture of my family. You can see the good looks come from my wife. All right, so, and I'm happy to answer more questions about anything in my personal life that you guys want to ask. So if you have any more questions, feel free to think about those, and at the end I'll answer those. So I like to couch the way that I reconcile things in the light of kind of my 5 main principles, okay? My first principle being, I accept truth and knowledge no matter where it comes from. So just let that sit for a second and think about it in your own hearts and your own minds. How does that sit with you? Are you okay with accepting truth, light, knowledge, however, good ideas, the best explanation, whatever language you use for that idea? Are you okay with accepting that, and it doesn't matter where it comes from? Okay, that's the first thing. So let me argue why I think this is why I do this. Many religious believers over the years have basically argued for the same thing. Thomas Aquinas said, faith accepts truth, accepts divine truth as it is, whatever its source. And just a fair warning, a lot of my quotes and the way that I look at the world through the eyes of an LDS Mormon guy. So obviously there's going to be an LDS bent, but if you are not LDS or not of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you're in a different religion, or you're not of a religion, just you can put any other dogma or religion and kind of think about how your particular institution might deal with these ideas. So in our church, we believe there's a prophet, and right now his name is President Russell Nelson. And he has said, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints embraces all truth that God conveys to his children, whether learned in a scientific laboratory or received by direct revelation from him. I mean, you can't be more direct than that. Now, whether in practice that's what really happens is a different issue, but at least that's a statement. The Dalai Lama has said, in my view, science and Buddhism share a search for truth and for understanding reality by learning from science about aspects of reality where its understanding may be more advanced. I believe that Buddhism enriches its own worldview. So when we have conflict between a religious idea and our scientific knowledge, I would argue that the conflict almost always, not entirely, but almost always comes from these three situations. When you have accurate religion and inaccurate science, inaccurate religion and accurate science, or inaccurate religion and inaccurate science. I believe, this is a belief that I have, that most always, I imagine there's scenarios where this is not true, but I believe that almost always, if you have accurate religion and accurate science, that should converge on the same truth. Should. Our prophet has also said, there is no conflict between science and religion, he said. And conflict only arises from an incomplete knowledge of either science or religion or both. So he's basically restating what, this was my idea originally, and then he said it after me. So whether, yeah, he heard me say it, yeah. Whether truth comes from a scientific laboratory or by revelation, it is compatible. The Catechism of the Catholic Church has said this: methodological research in all branches of knowledge, provided it is carried out in a truly scientific manner and does not override moral laws, can never conflict with the faith, because the things of the world and the things of faith derive from the same God. And I really like this last quote from Uchtdorf, who, remember, for a while he was one of the, in the first presidency, he's now just an apostle in the church. But I like this because he basically also points out that religion has got it wrong at times. Like, and it's okay to be wrong. Like, we've been wrong and we'll probably continue to be wrong. And I think that humility is important. Science has that same humility. If science is wrong and the evidence of experimentation and the pursuit of, of the best idea demonstrates that the previous idea was worse, we reject it. We kick it out and we accept the new knowledge. And so I think that humility on both parts is really important. So here's an example, right, where you have to be humble about accepting the truth. Now, you may all be laughing. Flat Earth. Of course the Earth isn't flat. We asked this question this semester at UVU. We asked more than 500 students this question. 1% of our students think that the Earth is flat. Now, I don't know whether they were joking. I hope they weren't, right? But that was what the percentage we got. And so some of you may be laughing out there in the audience. But of course it's flat. Look at that. I just showed you some serious evidence. I found this on a flat earther website where this is the picture, and of course it's flat, right? It's flat. You can't argue with that. It's flat. Well, obviously, that also kind of looks flat, but if you zoom out, it's not flat, right? It's round. So it all depends on kind of the view and the evidence, the amount of evidence that you're looking at. And I'm not going to go through all of these because many of you know these, but there's plenty of things that you can just do right now with your own eyes and experimentation to go and figure out the Earth is not flat, that the Earth is round, right? Very simple things. You can look at something from ground level, go up in an elevator and look, and you can see farther. You can look at, see that constellations that are in the northern hemisphere are not in the southern hemisphere. I mean, there's tons of things you can do. Okay? Flat earthers try to argue and have a model, but the model does not work. It may explain one observation, but it doesn't explain all observations. And the best models are the models that explain the maximum number of observations. So, what does this matter? Because I think that this is also a pattern for how we ought to think about all conflict that happens in our worldviews. We should accept all evidence to inform our worldviews and choices. And that sometimes requires humility. It requires you to say, my church might be wrong, or my political party might be wrong, or my science teacher might be wrong. Like, it's okay to be wrong. And so sometimes we need to recognize that. So that's why it's important to look for all evidence, for the maximum amount of evidence that finds those emergent truths that come out, the objective emergent truths. And choosing only some evidence as acceptable information that aligns with your preconceived worldview is not okay. That is what we call confirmation bias. And that is not okay when you're looking for truth. I love Darwin. I just say that and just stop right there. I always joke that the reason I really love my wife started studying medicine in Chile at the age of 16. Darwin started studying medicine at the age of 16. So I say the real reason I love my wife is because she kind of reminds me of Darwin. Because I kind of have an unhealthy man crush on Darwin. But Darwin said this when he was thinking about his idea of natural selection. This was the kinds of things that he was also saying and thinking. We allow the satellites and the planets, the suns, the universe, nay, whole systems of the universe to be governed by laws, right? Physics, chemistry. But the smallest insect we wish to be created at once by special act, creationism. And so he's like, that's silly. We should be allowed to try to figure out what are the natural processes that created the diversity of life on planet Earth. Just as physicists and chemists were able to figure out all of the natural processes that control that stuff. I mean, we no longer believe in a God that pulls the sun across the sky because we know that that's not how it happens. And so we threw out that idea, right? And thanks to Galileo and others who did this kind of work. And so we know that. Okay, so that's my first principle. How's that sit with everyone? Pretty good, right? Principle number 2, I do not think that God is a deceiver or a cheater. I think he understands and lives in perfect harmony with natural laws. So to explain this, you guys know that in maps and in like dictionaries and things like this, they set up their systems with traps, copyright traps, so that if anyone tries to take their map or their dictionary and tries to just copy it to reproduce it, this doesn't happen much anymore, but in the olden days when this was a big problem, they would set up copyright traps. So they would put roads that don't exist, rivers that don't exist, or definitions that don't exist in these works. And then if someone copied it, they could take it to court and they could prove beyond the reasonable doubt that they had copied their work. Okay, so plagiarism, copying. Where you'll see where I'm going in just a moment. We need to eat vitamin C, right? If we don't, what disease are you susceptible to? Scurvy. Now, if you go for a lot of organisms on planet Earth, they have the ability to do this pathway, this metabolic pathway here, that essentially creates ascorbic acid inside of their own bodies, and they do it all by themselves, starting with, what's up at the top? Glucose. What's glucose? Sugar. So they can go from sugar to ascorbic acid, okay, in their own bodies. They can just do that. And ascorbic acid is basically vitamin C. Well, we lost that ability about 63 million years ago, along with the rest of the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys and the apes and us. We don't have that ability anymore. We don't have that pathway in our bodies. Well, why don't we have scurvy then? Because we eat fruit. We ingest enough vitamin C. Hopefully, there's one right there. And this is why in the, remember if you were on a ship, they were called the lineys because they would have to take wines with them and things like that, right? Okay. So why is this important? It turns out that if you go and look at the actual gene that no longer is functioning in that pathway that would create vitamin C, it has mutations that have turned the gene off. And those mutations are in the exact same place in all of the organisms, as if it was copied, right? So this comes back to this whole copyright, this copy trap. If indeed God created all of those organisms individually, one at a time, that means he created them with a gene that doesn't work with the turn off button in the exact same place there. And it's not just this gene. I could stand here for the next 40 hours and give you hundreds of examples of this. So the question is, would God do that to try to deceive us? Why would he make it look like it's evolution when it's not? right? Same thing with the really famous case of the chromosome number 2. We have 46, the rest of the great apes have 48. If you go and look at this, you can see that in chromosome, you can see that, yeah. In chromosome number 2, notice that ours is really long, chimpanzees is broken into 2, so are gorillas and orangutans. Well, what happened? Well, if you go back, oh, wait, broken. No, actually, ours united, right? Because back here it would have been 48, 48, 48. And then along this lineage leading to humans, 2 short chromosomes fuse together, which, by the way, happens all the time. If you don't believe me, ask Dr. Hjelman here, who studies genome evolution. He knows that genomes fuse and fission all of the time. Happens a lot in evolutionary time. So that's what happened for us. Again, we know this, we can see this, there's evidence of this. And so once again, if indeed they're all created differently, that means God pasted the 2 things to, or made the chromosome number 2 longer, but made it look exactly like the 2 shorter chromosomes. I mean, with the genes in the same order. And I mean, it's like, I can't imagine a God would try to fool us that way. That just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me. Because my principle, again, is I don't believe God is a deceiver, okay? The other thing is, because I'm LDS, of course, the church has its own university. Would God allow evolution to be taught at the Lord's university if it really wasn't true, or if it was absolutely false? Let's just even say that. If it were absolutely false, would the leaders of the church allow it to be taught? No. But not only is it taught, you can go to the museum and there's an entire exhibition there on hominid evolution. It's required major for biology and evolutionary biology programs. So I just can't imagine a God, a loving God, who would try to deceive us to make things look like it was evolution if it wasn't, okay? My last 3 principles really are just more personal, just so you know. I think it's important to strengthen relationship with deity because I believe in God. If you don't believe in God, that's fine. Forget these 3 principles, okay? I also think it's important to strengthen relationships with others, and I really appreciated Dr. Graves being with us today. And if nothing else, I hope our students remember we need to have actions to teach, to treat each other well. But not just I say it, oh, I love everyone. We need to actions. We need to do things to treat each other better with kindness. And so I really think that's important. And then I think that I make and keep covenants, or at least I try to. So those last 3, again, are mostly important for me, but maybe you can adopt some of those. So what tends to cause the conflict sometimes is simply just a lack of understanding what is an official doctrine or position of a church. So think about that right now. Do you know what the official position of your church or your religious institution is about evolution? Do you absolutely know what it is? Yeah, he knows it is. How about out there? Do you guys absolutely know what it is? Some of you? Maybe? Okay, good. Well, this is hard because it's even hard to sometimes define what is official doctrine, right? Or is it a position? Because doctrine and position, are those the same things? Are they different things? I mean, we have a position in our church that you can't light candles inside the church. Catholic churches, you always light candles inside the church. But in our churches, you guys know this, right? It's against the rules to light candles. You can't have fire inside the church. Now, that's not some eternal doctrine. It's simply a policy, right? So figuring out what's a doctrine and a policy is difficult. And this is not perfect. I mostly just have this so that in whatever religion you are, think about this. Think about, of the products that come out of your religion, what is more official, what is more, what should you take more serious and what maybe you shouldn't? What's simply just opinion of some people, okay? And I don't have the perfect setup here. I'm just think about it. Maybe canonized text in the LDS tradition is the most serious. And then maybe official declarations. And then maybe general comment, and so forth. I don't know. I'm just saying, think about it, because not all words are equal. Not all statements are equal. So, you want to know what the official position of the church is? Good. Finally, someone knows. The official position is there is no position. And that I know that sounds kind of like a cop-out, but it is. And the church for a long time had many leaders who were very anti-science. Those were the ones that I was reading, listening to when I was young. But then in 1992, when I'm at BYU getting my undergrad, this publication comes out, and basically it was because you'd go to your religion class and you'd get all the quotes from the leaders saying evolution is bad, and you'd go over to your science class and the science teachers would have all the quotes, evolution is fine, it's okay. And you were quite confused. I was one of those confused students. But the church came out with this evolution packet in 1992, and it contains 4 things. And so if you're interested in the details of that, just Google it and you can read it. I'll just show a couple things here. One thing from the 1992 article, which was part of a 1931 statement, they say man to be the direct and lineal offspring of deity. Man is the child of God. Now notice it doesn't say anything whether that's the physical body or the spiritual body. I think there's really good evidence that that only refers to the spiritual. It does not mean physical. I think there's really good evidence to suggest that. And then, you know, it's like, let science do science down here. Like the church is not against science, so let it happen. I love this from the 1910 statement. That which is demonstrated, we accept with joy. And I liked it so much that I created a YouTube channel called Accept Truth with Joy. And if you want the shameless plug here, but you can go look at this. This is where I do little short videos about some of the tough topics. And I also do interviews to faithful, like religious scientists who work through these kinds of things. I just did one a few days ago with Dr. Whiting and just got it published this week. So if you're interested, you can go and look at that YouTube channel, Accept Truth with Joy from Heath Ogden. The church also had something published in 2016, but notice it's just restating what, I can't remember, what was your name in front? Jack, what Jack just said. The church, what? Jack?
No official position.
Yeah, the church has no official position on the theory of evolution. So if you want to accept it, fine. If you don't want to accept it, fine. Although then you're going to come into my class and I'm going to give you 4.5 weeks of evidence and evidence and evidence, right? Who's been in one of my classes before? Lots of evolution evidence, because I want to convince people that it's real. I think you're a better citizen of this planet when you understand evolution. There was also a recent, if you're interested, there was also just last year an article called Organic Evolution that was also published in the Church History Topics. You can go look that up if you want. It doesn't say anything more about the position. It just gives a history of organic evolution and the church. Oops, that didn't show. That's just me next to Origin of Species that was on display up at BYU last year.
First edition, right?
What? First edition. Yep, first edition. Again, there's these displays. And I only put this up here because this is no different than the University of Utah. That's the display at the University of Utah. I mean, sometimes people are like, well, at BYU, no, BYU has serious scientists doing serious evolution research, just like the University of Utah. It's all just evolution. Okay, last thoughts. Look, it's okay to have some disagreement and to just not know things for now. I was not okay with this when I was your age. I thought the world needed to be black and white. And I wanted exact answers from my leaders or from whoever. I needed to have that. I am now okay with not having all of the picture. I'm okay with that. And I know that's uncomfortable for many of us because we want to know. But guess what? We don't know everything. I mean, in science, we don't know everything. That's why we keep doing science. That's what's cool about science. And I think that religion needs to take that same kind of position. We don't know everything in religion. So let's just keep going forward. Even if there are disagreements, let's not get too up in arms about it, and let's just keep moving forward. As I've stated, I think we need more humility in science and from religion, but we should make decisions based on evidence. Whatever the best evidence is at the time, that's what we should do. And this was really uncomfortable during COVID. You guys remember that? Right at the beginning, you know, Fauci came out. In fact, Dr. Graves was on one of the early newscasts where they were talking about this. And, you know, the understanding at the beginning wasn't great. And so they were giving some advice. And then that started to change a little bit because we got more and more evidence. And then maybe it's changed a little bit more because we got more and more evidence. And the general public, and in particular, some people in the population did not like that. I thought, what a lost opportunity. Because everyone could have seen the nature of science, the process of science happening in real time. It could have been such a great opportunity for everyone to really kind of understand science, and instead it became a political nightmare. And probably because of that, 300 to 400,000 people died that didn't need to die, right? So real loss. So we need to make decisions based on evidence, not based on, I feel this, or I had, whatever. Here I'm going to speak for myself, but I hope some of my colleagues agree with me on this. I think scientists have not been very good in the past at communicating. I think we need to do a lot better job at communicating. And you, where my biology, any science and biology students out there, you are scientists. You understand that, right? You better. I look at you as a scientist, and you should look at yourself as scientists. And you need to be helping us in this effort of communication. So please help us. Help us get the message out on this, on science. Now, even though I do love Darwin, we have learned a lot about evolution since Charles Darwin. So it really bothers me when anti-evolution folks are like, oh, well, the Darwinian natural selection. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Or Darwinian evolution? I'm like, evolution is the most robust theory that we have in biology. And it encompasses, yes, natural selection, and yes, tree-like evolution, but it also encompasses tons of other stuff. I mean, 4 other mechanisms of evolution at a minimum, maybe even more. And so we've learned a lot about evolution since Charles Darwin. It has been demonstrated. So we shouldn't just sit with Darwin. We should celebrate him and eat cake in his honor, but then we should move on. So, and finally, just that which has been demonstrated, we should accept with joy. So that's kind of where I leave my talk, okay? My introductory remarks. Did I hit right about a half an hour? Yeah, perfect. Okay, no, don't clap. I mean, you can if you want. So for this part, when I just like to talk now. I'm here, but there are other people in the room that could also help comment as well, because I don't have all the answers, and sometimes my answers are terrible. So feel free to jump in, okay, as well. Let's just kind of have a discussion. But let's start. What questions do you guys have? Yeah.
What does religious exploration kind of look like in comparison to like science exploration or scientific exploration?
In some ways, they're akin to each other. For example, from the LDS tradition, there's this story in the Book of Mormon that says, experiment upon the word, right? Plant a seed. If the seed grows, then it's good. And that, but the difference is the evidentiary, the evidence that comes from spiritual exploration is personal truth, not social truth. It's not community truth, right? It's not emergent objective truth. And so it's kind of hard, because you may feel that scripture or that idea or that whatever is a truth to you, but you know what, the person sitting next to you could completely disagree and could think that they also got some spiritual manifestation that tells them something completely different. So what do you do with that? I mean, I don't know. That's a hard thing, right? From 2 different things. Yeah, Dr. Davis.
And also, particularly when you're dealing with ancient texts, it's really important to understand that text in the context of the people who wrote it. And so one of the things that biblical scholars do is they examine those texts. And one of the things you should recognize is that many of the texts from that time period were lost. And so archaeologists have discovered texts that weren't part of the narrative that came forward to us. And they've also been able to utilize linguistic tools. For example, one thing that most people don't know is when you look at the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, there are 5 different authors. And Moses is a person who probably never wrote any of them, if that person actually existed. So because of that kind of analysis, you have an understanding of who the authors were, when they were writing, what kinds of issues, were important to that society at that time, and so on. And that, I think, is a really fruitful example of the kind of research, biblical scholars do, telling us about who those people were, what they believed, what their issues were, and specifically who they were, because oftentimes we believe that individuals existed who really didn't. So that's very important stuff to know.
And that's like religious scholarship, right? Not you going after some religious personal truth. That's what I was trying to differentiate between, right? And because for me, the process of finding out, does God really love me? Does this scripture seem to resonate with me? Is a personal journey that I take that in some ways is kind of like a scientific journey, but the evidences that demonstrate to my heart that that is a good idea for me is personal. It's a spiritual, personal thing. And I think that it's hard to sometimes think that, because especially in the LDS tradition, we really like to think that everyone has the same truth, right? And we always get up to the testimony meeting, and I know that this is true and this is true. And then the next person gets up and says the exact same thing. And so we tend to think that we all need to have this exact same truth. Well, it turns out that that's probably needs to be a little bit more mushy. Does that hit on your question okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm going to ask this question, and I'm happy to reward it, because I have a background in philosophy and religious studies in particular. And growing up in Utah, obviously, if you go to school, I went here to UVU, you study LDS religion, there's a lot of scholarly work, lots of folks are focused on that. So my question is, what is the epistemic responsibility of a religious group to make sure that people who are part of that group, right? And I'm talking about the LDS Church in particular, but also Mormonism, it's a more broad thing that encompasses other groups. What is the epistemic responsibility of leadership, in this case, to push for truth and push for a more scientific understanding about things that really affect all of us, things like climate change, which is huge here in the state, things like evolution, things like reproductive justice, things like poverty, racial issues, right? Utah has a lot of history of difficulties with that. So what do you think is a perspective?
Well, I mean, my personal opinion really doesn't matter because they don't listen to me. But I wish that they would have a better point of view, like you're explaining. I wish, but it's probably not perfect. Now, again, it's a mixed bag because you have a lot of people trying to move a big organization, and sometimes decisions take a long time to make. Even the right decisions sometimes take a long time to make. And also, our church has not been very good at recognizing when they've made mistakes and correcting for that. And so I wish, my own personal view is I wish that, you listen to my principles, right? I wish we would make evidence-based decisions even in the church, but that doesn't always happen. So I don't know if anyone else wants to address that issue. I'm really not probably the person that should address it because I'm just a lowly biology teacher. Yeah.
I'm a retired physics teacher, and for probably the last 40 years of my career, so like 50 years long, I've worried about the right answer. As a professor, we teach something, we give a test, and if you get the right answer, I'll give you points. I think we're building a bias for what you complained about in your first statements, that everybody expects a black and white, clear solution, clear answer. And I've come to believe, I think as you do, that there's an awful lot of gray in the spaces between the black and white. How do we teach that?
I don't know. Well, one thing that we can do is you can reward the process and not just the result, right? So grading is one way that as a professor, I can do that. I can reward the process and not just did you get right. Because sometimes there's lots of right answers, lots of wrong answers, lots of okay answers, right? So that's one thing. Any other questions? Yes.
In one of your final 5 points about scientists need to communicate better, like with who directly? Is that like people who just don't do science? I have a follow-up question.
Yeah. Did you want to, Carl, did you want to jump in on that one or no?
I mean, I could. I think that scientists need to communicate with, yeah. I think that scientists need to communicate with everybody better, regardless if you're a scientist. To scientists, there's a lot of lack of communication between scientists that occur. We get kind of stuck in our own fields and don't talk to other people, or stuck in competing labs, and so we won't collaborate. We're all competing for funding. We don't want to be stealing our ideas, for example. A big problem is also communicating with the public and finding the best way to do that. And that's difficult, especially with those, for many of us who get a lot of training in science, we think very scientifically and often forget how to explain that to someone who hasn't had all the same experiences as us. I see that a lot with me trying to talk to my family, for example. I am the only person who's gone, aside my dad has a bachelor's, other than that, no one does. Brother drops out of high school, etc. And so I'm coming in from PhD level postdocs, etc., trying to explain science to people who don't remember anything from their science classes. And so how can we try to explain the concepts and the evidence in a way that makes sense without seeming like we're talking down to people, and that we want to simplify it in the right way without oversimplifying. I think it's important for people to recognize the messiness of the process. I try as much as my students probably don't like it when they ask me questions to explain far too many of the exceptions to those rules, because I don't give them a black and white answer. I'm like, it depends. For the test, know this, but know that in the world it's crazy and messy. But that requires us to go into years more discussion to get to that point. So I think it's difficult at all levels. Scientists need to do better at all levels. And I encourage a lot of students to look into how people communicate science. I just finished Dr. Gray's book. I really enjoyed it as a scientist. I felt like it was really easy to understand, but Dr. Gray said that there are some people who said it was too convoluted in terms of too scientific, too high up, right? I mean, we're coming from different perspectives. I have a lot of people, I suggest a lot of people read Carl Zimmer, for example, another science communicator. So how can we find new ways to explain super difficult concepts? Because as we've seen from COVID, the scientists talking in the way that scientists are all supporting is difficult for the public to support. So that's kind of my take.
I just say ditto to all of that. That was great. Good question. Did you have a follow-up, you said?
Yeah, it's like, okay, so those are the people we're trying to connect with, and more like how, which you kind of answered, like simplified, but not too simplified. But it's just like how, I believe there needs to be like a common culture, like some commonality that you can communicate.
Yeah. And specifically, like with this issue of evolution, I mean, we've studied this. Cool. People communicate when you communicate. That's not.
It's not.
Here at UVU, I've studied, trying to help students understand evolution, and it turns out that students are much more willing to kind of listen and then accept evolution if the person teaching it is also a religious scientist, which it shouldn't be that way. It should be that we can just teach the evidence and then people accept, right? But we actually ran the study, and it turns out that this population is better at accepting evolution if they hear it from a religious scientist. I wish it weren't that way.
Yeah, so it's like a humanities problem, like
A little bit.
some intersection of it.
Yeah. Okay, good questions. Others? There's another hand that came up. Yeah, go ahead.
There seemed to be such an aversion to the idea of intelligent design from some scientists.
Well, what do you mean by intelligent design?
That evolution happened, but there was a God who started the process, I guess, and maybe guides it.
Well, I think a lot of religious, if that's all you mean from intelligent design,
Well, it's probably not like understand.
then I would argue that that's more like what we would call theistic evolution, what you're describing. And I kind of that's kind of how I would describe myself, as a theistic evolution. But I would always say that in what we know right now about evolution, it does not require any deity. We can explain everything in evolution just fine without the need to invoke a creator. But as a religious scientist, I actually think there is something there. And so I like the idea that, I don't know, maybe he did get it going, or maybe he oversees it, I don't know. All I know is that we don't have to invoke him in every step. Now, what intelligent design as it is usually used, those words are usually used, it is essentially creationism that just allows for long periods of time and allows for microevolution to occur. But intelligent design, as proposed by like those from the Discovery Institute, they still are proposing that all major kinds of organisms were special creative acts from an intelligent designer. And so that kind of intelligent design is just creationism rebranded. And we know that also because the court case in Dover, Pennsylvania basically showed that and showed that it was just creationism rebranded. And that was overseen by a Catholic conservative judge who oversaw that and basically said, yeah, we don't want to be teaching that in our schools. That's just creationism. So, yeah, Dr. Graves.
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Ogden said. If you believe that there is a supreme being who's the author of the rules of the universe, and, evolution was one of those rules that supreme being put into action, okay, then you don't need to use these so-called examples of intelligent design. And each one of those examples used by people like the Discovery Institute are attempts to say, well, natural selection couldn't have done that. And every one of those examples, in fact, have fallen on their face. Natural selection could have easily done the things. For example, the vertebrate eye is one of the examples they use.
Blood clot.
Yeah, the flagella of bacteria and so on. Every one of those examples have fallen on their face. So in my denomination, we take the position that there is a God, who is the author of the rules of the universe. And we do not limit God in terms of the tools that God would use to create that universe. There's absolutely no reason to do that. And I honestly think that people who are in the Discovery Institute and special creationists, their understanding of God is limited, and their confidence and their faith in God is limited. I don't need someone to show me exactly how creation occurred to accept God. I mean, the word tells me that I believe from things that are not seen. I don't need to see. I know God is there. So that's a weakness, I think, of their sorts of theology. They have to see in the universe concrete evidence that God is there. I don't need that.
I like that. Did that answer your question?
Well, help me understand each other of the terms.
Yeah, I mean, there's this book that I have my students read in my class. It's called Only a Theory. And one of the chapters actually says that you couldn't, in one of the quotes from this author, Kenneth Miller, he says, they couldn't probably have chosen a better name. It's a really good name because it's like intelligent design. So it'd be stupid if you would have said like stupid creation or something like that, right? But it was intelligent design. So it sounds really good, but it's kind of like the example I gave with the sun, right? We don't invoke a special God that's pulling the sun across the sky because we understand how that works. We understand there are natural laws in physics that are the movement of celestial bodies. So we don't need to invoke that God is actually pulling across the sky. That doesn't mean that God couldn't have been over, right? The overarching architect. Yeah.
So would most scientists agree that it's very possible there was a theistic origin to the process?
I'll have to remember the study, the most recent one, but I think it's about, it depends on which science you're talking about. So, in biological sciences, I think it's like 15% are religious.
Yeah.
About 15%. If you go over to chemistry, it bumps up to about 30%. And then if you go to something like computer science, it's like 80% probably, right? It's like a lot higher. Because they're the intelligent designers, right?
I don't understand this, but God knows.
Oh, that's what it is. Oh, dear God, let this work. Let this program work. Another question? Yeah.
Yeah, just the backside to the other question is, so what's the epistemic responsibility of scientists to inform the public about mistakes they've made, about advances, about even I would say bad faith actors. I'll give an example of climate change in the 80s. BP hired folks to basically do the science so they could save their investments.
We have a huge responsibility. It was like that one slide Dr. Gaines put up today in his thing. I kind of wish he would have just stayed on that for like 10 and just started going, here's an example of this, here's an example of this, here, right? But I mean, that's the kind of things that we have more time to do in our classes. I know that Carl does this in many of his classes. I try to do some of it. You know, and there's a lot of my colleagues that we're invested in this. We want to be more accountable to what was done that was not correct. And sometimes it's telling that story again. Once again, it teaches people about the process of science. It teaches people about how science is not perfect. We're in the direction of those emergent truths, that objective reality, right? That's coming out, and we're getting closer and closer to that. And you know, we throw out the good bad ideas, the bad ideas, and we keep the good.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Hunt, because I really should have spent more time on that.
That's what I just wanted selfishly.
Yeah, no, but at the end of the day, though, I think people make a big mistake between conflating the methods of science, which we teach in intro science, versus the enterprise of science. I spend a great deal of time in all my books on the enterprise of science. Scientists are human beings who exist in a web of social relations and social contradictions. And so, yeah, there are plenty of scientists who have been paid to support a particular worldview. They're like, for example, the tobacco industry and so on. And also scientific racism, or what I call scientistic racism, because it was their work to support the enslavement of human beings, to support the idea that these people could be bought and sold because they weren't as human, they were less intelligent, and so on. That has happened throughout the entire history of the scientific enterprise. And so it is the responsibility of moral people to conduct moral acts, no matter what discipline they're in. And unfortunately, I work in a discipline where, you know, not everybody's morals are where they should be. But that's true of virtually every discipline that exists.
Other questions? Yeah.
So, sorry, I'll try to speak up. Something that's interesting to me is how science, oftentimes in science, we use models to explain things that we can't necessarily see with our own eyes, like things like electrons and things like that, or some phenomena that are hard to explain otherwise, like maths and numbers. And so we use scientific modeling to demonstrate some things that we observe in real life using these kind of made up models. So how do you think, or do you think that God, or the idea of a deity, could just be sort of a model that mankind has created to explain the things we see in our lives or in this world, whether that's physical or, between relationships and things like that?
Yeah, I think
God's a real being, or do you think
I think he is, but I think it's perfectly reasonable and very likely that he's a construct, that it is a construct. I mean, because you think about it, we claim that God, I claim that God is loving, right? Well, then why did, Homo sapiens been around for 300 million years, or 300,000 years. Why only 6,000 years ago did he start talking to him, right? So, or why were there the Dark Ages? In our church, we think that in the LDS tradition, it's like, there was an apostasy, and then he didn't talk to anyone until Joseph Smith again, right? Like that doesn't, if God really loved everyone, why wasn't he talking? So you can go down that pathway and start to do those kinds of things. But again, this comes back to the idea of, I have my own little personal truth where I've had my own little spiritual experiences, and so I accept that God exists, and that's for me, and I live my life according to that. But I think it's perfectly reasonable that someone doesn't. I think that is, at the end of the day, then just let's be moral, let's be good to each other, right? Yeah.
Is there a limit to what can be considered personal truth?
Probably, if you're doing things that harm others, then I don't think that you can say, oh, that's my personal truth. Right? And I don't know, there's probably other exceptions to that. That's the one thing that comes out really quickly. It's not okay to harm others. Yeah.
science communication is really important to me, and I find that like sometimes I do a good job and sometimes I don't, but particularly when I'm in a situation kind of like how Carl described, I'm also a first-gen student. No one in my family cares at all about college. They don't care that I'm going. They never care to go. And so I find myself often in a position where it's really difficult to talk about the things I'm learning, to talk about, new ideas that I'm excited about in a way that's not just like demeaning. So, and then, I get to thinking, if I were to like bring my positionality into it, and talk about first, in my spiritual beliefs and then talk about the science, would this conversation go differently? And so I'm just kind of wondering, as someone who like really wants to be an exceptional science communicator, where are the synergies that I can, like, what synergies between science and religion can I take advantage of to really like allow people who are deeply committed to religious beliefs to also become committed to scientific beliefs?
It's a great question. I mean, I like some of the things we've said before, like don't talk down to them, be on their level, but they first have to trust you. So sometimes you have to, it's about timing, right? And so it may be that people who you're going to be able to most affect are people that know you the best too. So let yourself get to know people, and then when it's the right time, then you share those things. Or if something's on, you don't have to be a jerk about it. I also find that asking questions is a really good way to do conversations. Oh, why do you think that, da, 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 da? Well, what do you think about, and let them, and then you can propose new ideas. Well, do you think it could be possible? Or what evidence would you need to see in order to stop believing in the flat earth? Right? It says, you're an idiot for believing that. I can't believe you believe that, you're an idiot, right? Like so, I mean, and you're not that way, so I don't think you would do that, but practicing those kinds of skills, and there's lots of books out there that talk about this kind of issue, how we be better scientific communicators are out there. So it's those kinds of things is what I would do. But personal relationships, that's the best place where you can help people change their minds, is personal relationships.
Absolutely. Only gonna say a couple of things about that. First and foremost, I don't think you should ever use the term scientific belief. So there's a scientific method that, falsifies hypotheses and presents evidence. And a person can then accept the evidence on its strength, or they can reject it. It's not something you believe in. Okay, I believe in the existence of God, precisely because I can't provide you with any intellectual or material proof in the existence of a supernatural entity, because by definition, that entity is above nature. And so therefore, I believe that God exists. I don't believe that evolution exists. I can demonstrate using the fossil record that there are new life forms on this planet that weren't here, a billion years ago. Okay, so it's a question of the strength of the evidence and whether you accept or reject the evidence, not a belief system. And I agree with, Dr. Rodman, it comes down to, if you're a scientist and you want to help communicate your science, you need to be engaged in your community. I'm engaged in my church. People respect me as a member of the congregation who works for the good of our people. And therefore, they're more likely to listen to me. At my institution, which is a historically Black institution, and all of them were founded with strong faith commitments. Most of them didn't teach evolution, period, until I came to North Carolina A&T in 2005. Now, not only are we teaching evolution, we are producing more African-American scientists in evolutionary biology than any place in the nation. And that's because of the work that I put in and that of my colleagues over the last 15 years. So that's how you do it. Okay, you be engaged in your community, and people become to know you, and they come to trust you.
I'm just gonna add a little bit, that's not any different than what has really been said, but I think part of it is an aspect of listening. And I think that's the tough part for those of us who are coming in with evidence that we know we have the evidence, that we accept the evidence, we think everybody should accept that. But it can be difficult unless to understand why someone isn't accepting that. And so listening to their viewpoint and trying to, we can't make massive changes all at once, right? Our piece of evidence that we think is enough might not be enough for everybody. And so being able to listen and have a potentially very slow and calm conversation, kind of guiding viewpoints. I mean, it's very common now here that I have missionaries stop at my door And we have a lot of conversations. I love talking about worldviews and faith and religion. I grew up religious, but I am no longer religious, but that
Just
doesn't.
getting baptized on Saturdays.
Yeah, so it's always a fun conversation just to hear how people kind of connect their worldview to the things that I find beauty in, right? I think that religion and all these things are beautiful. The sense of community and hope it gives people in connection. I think that's a wonderful thing. And so I express these things and I express the beauty in the world and the interconnectedness that I find with those things. And there's this kind of common ground that comes to that with those types of conversations. Rather than trying to find ways to separate, find a way to bring it together, to recognize that beauty that you understand through a scientific process, that someone else might present more from their worldview or their religious view. And so it becomes a slower, more gradual change, but people are more receptive to that type of conversation. Again, just trying to be at a similar level and show that kind of respect and listening on both sides. Because it's really easy to be like, no, you're wrong. Here's my evidence. But listening and asking why, I think, is an important part of those conversations.
Yes.
So when it comes to communicating science, there's obviously the day-to-day stuff where you're communicating with family members and like trying to help them understand it. But communicating with the public, what are some strategies that we can employ? Because, for instance, reading scientific literature, that's a very difficult thing that you actually have to learn how to do in your undergraduate and even post that.
So where are you thinking you might be interacting with the public?
Just like when you.
Or are you looking for opportunities? Or are you thinking social media?
Yeah.
Social media is tough.
I think part of what he's saying is there's a disconnect between scientific literature and social media, or what
Yeah.
the common
And,
people
like,
perceive.
It's tough, it's tough, social media is tough. I kind of have a rule that if any of my friends, my close friends, on Facebook, for example, post something that is scientifically inaccurate, and I try to, in a good way, get on there, if you thought about it this way, or I try to do a little bit of that, it doesn't really go very far now. But I've made that decision to at least be there because I'm not gonna change usually that person's mind, but I hope my cousins and my cousins' kids are watching me interact with my crazy uncle, for example. This is being recorded, I shouldn't have said that. I respect it.
How do we address that disconnect though? Writing scientific literature and whatnot?
I don't know, it's kind of what we've been saying, you just try your best, okay? Get to know people, have that personal interaction, it's gonna be really, really good.
Well, for somebody who's been writing, popular articles and books for the public for the last 30 years, it starts with scaffolding. You need to know what the misconceptions about a particular subject are amongst your audience. And then you begin to provide a connection between their misconceptions and the way things actually work. And so what you attempt to get them to do is to begin to employ the general tools of critical thinking. In other words, why do you believe what you believe about X, Y, or Z? And then you can work through which of these things are logical fallacies. Like, for example, people think that there are biological races in the human species. Now, why they believe that, they don't actually really know. They just sort of see, oh, wow, looking around the room, people have different physical characteristics. Therefore, they must be biological races. So I work through, well, exactly how do we define a biological race? And what are these traits you're looking at? Do they fall into the definitions of biological races? And so you walk them through step by step by step, because the things you know, they don't know. And you're basically teaching them in your writing.
Okay, yes.
One more question.
Yeah.
So I understand how, as a scientist, you don't, and a religious person, you can't scientifically back up the existence of God. You can't prove it. So shouldn't be forced to be taught to other people. But when it comes to maybe not religion, but more just morality or ethics, sometimes there are cases where it might actually advance science to do something, but it would be unethical. So if science actually would, I guess, sort of defend something that would be considered unethical or immoral,
how do you like, comparing those two, doesn't that kind of not make sense? How it's like, well, because science doesn't support religion, we can't like promote that really like in schools or in our jobs or our careers or at universities. But if science would, you know, defend or promote something, but it might not be ethical or moral, we're more okay with saying like, well, yeah, science does support that, but let's not teach it.
I think we should be moral and ethical. I mean, that's just the simple answer, right? And I would hope that most scientists want that as well. Our country and then the scientific organizations that belong to this have codes of conduct and ethics. And so that all is, there are structures and systems set up to try to protect that, but not all places in the universe agree with those ethics and morals.
Yeah, I was just gonna make that same point. You should never talk about, quote, science, because that makes things extremely abstract and unrelated to the real world we live in. There are scientists. Scientists exist within social structures, and they have agendas. And some of those agendas are not moral. A perfect example were people like Mengele, when he worked for the Nazis. And he did all sorts of experiments on twins that were unethical, immoral, and terrible. And information came out of that. Now, it turns out that the information was useless because his scientific method was terrible. But he was pursuing the state policy of the Nazi regime. Okay? In the United States, as Professor Ogden has pointed out, we have scientific organizations that have codes of conduct with regard to moral and ethical behavior of their members. Now, I have to tell you that those things have evolved because they didn't start out being so good. But we've made progress with regard to things that scientists, will allow and things that they won't. For example, when the Chinese scientists cloned genes into the germline of two twins in that country with the CCR5 mutation, that was uniformly condemned across the world by scientists and their organizations as an unethical and immoral act. Now, does that mean that there aren't groups doing that? Of course there are. So, but again, it's not science. It's scientists under particular social conditions that are doing that.
Other questions? We kind of sit down on this good subject. I love it. It's the first time I've ever had this talk and I haven't received the first question that I always get. So this has been really refreshing.
Do you want someone to ask that?
No, you don't have to. I'm fine if you don't.
I want to know what that first question is.
Yeah. I'm sure that someone knows what the first question is. All right. You've been mentored before. I can't believe no one's asked the first question.
What about Adam and Eve?
That's what it is.
Yeah.
This is usually the first question I get because it just feels like everyone always wants to know about Adam and Eve. Do you want to talk about the Adam and Eve or not?
I would love to talk about Adam and Eve because I have a new paper all about Adam.
Oh, cool. Maybe you can inform us too. So when people talk about Adam and Eve, they usually want to know when and where. So in order to understand this, though, you have to first also understand what's the scientific body of evidence surrounding the evolution of humans. Now, you can take my class and I'll teach you about the other species of hominins that have existed on this planet. We're just going to start with Homo sapiens, okay? So Homo sapiens evolved from another Homo species. But we can say for sure that we can even now say about 300,000 years ago, but let's just use the date that I have up here. For sure, by 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens is its own kind of species. It's in the modern form that exists right now. And where are they living? In Africa. So the other night, in fact, my daughter asked, or my son was like, "So Dad, what are you?" He asked me what I am. And I think that in school they were trying to like, are you, from Germany or from England? And like, that's what they were getting at. And my son said, "Dad, what are you?" And I said, "Well, it depends on how far back you want to go." My wife rolls her eyes and he goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "Well, if we go back to 100,000 years, I'm African." So let's do that. Go back to school and tell them that your dad is African. And say, if you're being 100,000 years ago. So anyway, so at 200,000 years ago, that's where we're all living. This is the short version of this, just in Africa. A bottleneck occurs that maybe goes down to about 10,000 individuals at about 100,000 years ago. And out of that population comes the Homo sapiens that then go throughout the rest of the planet. They go up into Europe, they go into Asia, they go down into the Indonesia, down into Australia, over the Bering Strait, over into North and South America. Okay? And it's a repeated migratory founder effect, genetic drift event that's happening, and the genetic diversity gets less and less and less and less as you go across the world. The most genetic diversity that exists in the human population is in Africa. If you randomly took one person and a random person from Africa and then did it again, they're going to be more like, or the Africans are more different than each other than they are to the person you randomly select. I mean, it's crazy the way that the genetics work here. So we know this. This is something that we're very confident about. So, so then if you go into kind of the religious model, I'm just showing the migrations here. Yeah, they are. And then we get down to where the population really starts to grow. And now are we at 8 billion now? 8 billion, I didn't change my slide. 8 billion people. And the question that usually gets asked is, what about these two people that supposedly existed? So the first thing is, we don't know if those two people even were real or did exist, or if they're just allegorical. We don't know that. Like there's no evidence that does that. And so once again, it comes back to, well, it's in a religious text. And so then if you want to have a personal truth that they did exist or didn't exist, that's up to you. Let's go down the pathway that maybe they did exist. In our church, we believe they are the first man, and it says that Adam is the primal parent of our race. Now, those are complicated statements for me, unless I do some mental gymnastics, but that's what you always have to do when you start to deal with religious texts or religious statements from leaders. So one way to reconcile this is to say, well, Adam and Eve lived at 6,000 years ago. If that's true, they're not the first Homo sapiens on planet Earth, right? Right? Okay, so that we know for sure. Well, could they have been part of that original population way back at 200,000 or whatever it would have been? Well, maybe. But even if that's true, they're living in a population of people. It's not just Adam and Eve. There's always a population. This is why Sasquatch is a hoax. People think that it's like one individual walking around the woods. It would need to be a population of Sasquatches walking around. Okay? So Adam and Eve would always have existed in a population of people. Always. Wherever you put them. You can put them in any one of those. And then in my religion, we believe that they were placed into the Garden of Eden. So perhaps if they were real people, they were plucked out of this population, placed somewhere that was unique and special, the Garden of Eden. And maybe that had different conditions. I don't know. But now, once you've gone down the rabbit hole of supernatural, then you can invoke whatever you want, right? So maybe there was special conditions or something. And fine, and you can make that work with kind of your worldview that you've always had with Adam and Eve. Okay? Put them wherever you want, but they get plucked out of the Garden of Eden, and then they're in the Garden of Eden for a while, and then you go through the Garden of Eden story in the fall and everything. Okay? The way that I then reconcile that first two statements on the top of being first man or primal parent is I think that has to mean that they were the first with the Homo sapiens physical body, and, so not just end there, you can't end there, Homo sapiens physical body, and they had on the inside of that body a spiritual offspring of God, the Spirit, and they were the ones that made gospel and covenants first. That's why they were first. They were the first ones who learned about the gospel and who made covenants with deity. And that's how I reconcile it. I know that's, again, and someone could claim, well, that's very mental gymnastic-y, and it is. But I've already kind of gone down the rabbit hole a little bit, right, of supernaturalism. And so that's where I go. And at least that does not contradict everything that I've learned about the evolution of Homo sapiens. It doesn't, I can make those reconcile. And that's kind of, I know that's unsatisfactory to maybe many of you, but that's kind of how I do it.
If I can add, so if we go on the basis of the story in Genesis, in which I concur, now we're talking about a supernatural era. One of the things I'm absolutely sure about is they wouldn't have had those physical features.
That's for sure.
And this is.
I forgot to mention that.
So in my most recent article called Out of Africa, where faith, science, and religion collide, the vision that persons of European descent have of the characters in the Bible are people who had Northern European features. That can't possibly have been true. So at best, they would have had Middle Eastern features of the people who live in the Levant today. So they would have been darker skinned. They certainly wouldn't have had blonde hair. For example, if we're talking about 6,000 years ago, that would have been about the time the first blonde-haired mutation appeared in Northern Europeans, and the first blue-eye mutation appears in Northern Europeans. Ancient DNA of Europeans 7,000 years ago showed that they had, pigment characteristics of Africans, not of modern-day Europeans. So those fair skin phenotypes that Europeans display today are results of the most recent evolution in Europe. Not when Europeans got there 45,000 years ago. Those people had African features. So when I tell that, story to people at my institution, oh yeah, they're totally cool with that. Like, no, I'm not a historian in Black institution. But when I tell that to folks of European descent, they sort of look at me askance.
But I always sometimes say too as well, I don't know how many of you are LDS have been to the temples, right? Where we have the videos that happen and they represent the story of Adam and Eve. I can't wait for the time when it's two black actors that are doing that movie instead of white people. So that's all it's been every time.
Chinese in there.
Yeah, or just make a bunch of different versions and who cares what they look like, yeah.
I have a question about you said at the 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, there were always a group of them. How does that work with evolution? Like when the second chromosome changes, does it just change in one?
Well, when those chromosomes, that's even earlier than that. Like that predates even the split from Neanderthals. So that's way, way back. But it's kind of, when it's happening, it's like when mutations happen in a population, unless it is selectively advantageous, the probability that that mutation is going to become fixed in the population is 1 over the size of the population. So if populations are smaller, then these near neutral changes can basically become more prevalent just based on random genetic drift. But if they're selectively advantageous, then natural selection sees that and can sweep that through the population much quicker. Okay? But yeah, there would have been a time when there would be some people who were 48 chromosomes, 47 chromosomes, and 46 chromosomes. By the way, today, right now on planet Earth, there are people that are 48, 46, and 47. And sometimes that's a reason why they can't have children, because their sperm or egg are incompatible. So there are fusions and fissions that are happening all the time. I was going to say something else. Oh, the other thing that I like to think about when you're thinking about these changes, because again, it's not like, Homo ergaster, boom, Homo sapiens. Like it doesn't just go like that. Think about this like with languages, right? The Latin language became, what languages are Latin based? Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese. Well, when did Spanish and Portuguese become Spanish and Portuguese instead of Spanish y Boca? I don't know what you would call it. Whatever it is, back at that time, right? But you understand what I mean, right? Like there's no exact time because it's an evolutionary process that's always happening. And the language of Spanish today is different from the language of Spanish of 100 years ago. So it's always evolving, right?
I just have like something quick to add to that. If you're trying to understand evolution, something that really helped me understand how traits can like change over long periods of time is sexual selection. So when people talk about like evolution, they often talk about natural selection, which is often the environment selecting based on what's most favorable. But sexual selection is also a huge driver of mutation. And if a mutation happens and someone finds it sexually favorable, they'll reproduce and the mutation gets passed on to the next generation. So for me, that's kind of what helped me to understand how these features can evolve over time. Sexual selection plays a big part of that.
Other questions about Adam and Eve or? Yeah.
So are you saying that you believe that there's been Homo sapiens that don't have spirit?
No, well, no, that's why I had that.
Interpret this up here.
Again, I could be completely wrong, okay? So I'm just saying this. That's why I had the third characteristic there. Because I actually think that all Homo sapiens also have a spirit of child of God inside of them. And that's why, just as we do baptisms for the dead, I think that there's going to be some vicarious work that allows everyone who is a Homo sapien to at some point inherit salvation.
And, you know, some of us take the Adam and Eve story as being symbolic.
Yeah.
And that's where I stand. It's symbolic, because I think that all of these people had spirits. And they also communed with God in different ways. And so what we know of in terms of the Christian faith are the narratives that came out of the Levites. And that was the way those people understood God. So I don't think, for example, my God would have just said, oh yeah, you people in the Levite, you're the only ones I'm going to talk to. That's just not my God. Right? My God was talking to people all over the world, and how they understood God and how that worked into their cultural narrative was different.
And that's kind of where I sit as well, is that same kind of thinking. But again, if they're real people, they were real people, that's fine. It's just, it has to fit within the evidentiary, what exists as evidence for Homo sapiens. Like what I can't do is throw out all the evidence of science and say, well, my Sunday school teacher told me Adam and Eve were real people and lived it 6,000 years ago, and they were the first Homo sapiens. I can't do that because the evidence that I look at is overwhelming. So then I have to think about other ways that I reconcile. And it's a continuum. And you know what? It's okay to also move on that continuum. There might have been a time when Dr. Graves maybe was more of a literalist. And then there might have been a time when he was less even of believing.
Totally literal in my youth.
And then maybe, maybe next year he'll be at a different point. And that's how it is for me. I'm a happy seeker of just finding what's the best current position for myself. And I'm okay with that. This is the problem where it comes back to this idea of we want to be so sure of things. And I'm now more comfortable with uncertainty. I'm okay with uncertainty. I'm okay with that.
So W.V.O. Quine, when he was explaining why he was a naturalist, he just said, I have a preference for desert landscapes. So I feel like, not only is it non-falsifiable to say that there is a God, it seems that a lot of people believe science disproves God, which it does not. Science can't disprove non-falsifiable things. So it seems like the discourse is kind of dominated by the perspective that science is on the side of atheism. Why do you think that is, or how did that come about?
I don't know. Do you know that?
I don't know. Because there was a strong trend of atheists who were scientists. And so they wrote the narrative. And the only expression is that history is written by the winners. So they infused their worldview into the scientific process. And in part, because they were battling with biblical literalism at the time they were coming into their own. So they felt that they had to have this position of, well, there's no God, and nature just works the way it does, versus being able to accommodate the existence of the divine and still being able to use that scientific method to understand how nature works. So it's a case of who wrote the history of science.
I think it's also perhaps a case of either your science teachers or your ecclesiastical leaders not taking the time to explain the nature of science and the nature of faith. Right? From what I've learned from Dr. Ogden's class, he spends a lot of time, in the faculty here too, a lot of time talking about the nature of science. What is science? Once you clarify that, I think students and I work with students, as the TA, helping them understand this concept, they're more willing to accept it because there's that, this is not addressable by science, or this is not addressable by religious explanation.
I just want to add a little bit to that statement, to that sentiment about, I think the statistic was what, 15% of
15% of
biologists?
biologists, I believe. Was it.
So, I think we're going on this idea that science can, we're testing the natural world and where we can't falsify the supernatural, right? And I think that many people who might consider them or be grouped in, lumped in this idea of atheism, for example, might consider themselves more on the spectrum of agnosticism with science, because with science, we recognize that we can falsify things. We can't say that we've proven something in most cases. We can always just say it's not wrong right now, right? It's maybe the best answer we have. But we know we can't do that with a supernatural being. And so many of us go, like myself, I consider myself more agnostic than I would say an atheist, because if there is a higher being, I don't think it's affecting the natural world, the natural order of things. I'm not expecting some big change to occur. And so if there is one, there's no way I could prove or disprove. So, do the right thing. We have one world, one life. That viewpoint, I think, kind of overflows into this. But, some people might claim that atheists, like, there's that claim that atheists don't have morality or something. My brothers, when they found out I wasn't religious, asked me if I still believed in love, for example. Right? I mean, I think that it doesn't, just because, we maybe some people might have more of their worldview kind of based in the scientific method, doesn't mean that they're saying everything else is wrong, but they just know that some people just know that it can't be a huge part of maybe how they shape their views.
So I guess follow up to whoever, should there be a push to get rid of these labels then? I mean, like, the terms of like theist, atheist, agnosticism, they describe ideas, but like at the end of the day, we're all just operating on like, we have like this constitutive naivete where we don't, like, we all believe things that are not falsifiable. So like, should there be a push to get rid of those labels or categorizations or binarizations or whatever?
I don't think that we necessarily need to. I think if the categorization is harmful, then we need to address whatever that harm is. I mean, I think sometimes we do need a label because it is a label to recognize something of harm, right? We're not going to stop putting flammable or carcinogen or something on our chemicals, right? I mean, we shouldn't say that, like, dissolve the name of the KKK, for example. We need to know that that's a thing, right? But I think that we should recognize that maybe we're all more connected in this viewpoint of, there maybe shouldn't be this big distinction of this religion is right and this religion is right. That maybe there's, again, recognizing the common ground between these viewpoints and, again, promoting this acceptance of science and the evidence that we have, I think is an important aspect in my opinion there.
Humans categorize, right? And in some things, I think we need more categories. Like, I don't know, again, it's like black, white, like on forms, that makes no sense. I mean, if you want to do it, then do it like they do in like the makeup aisle or something. Like you have 4, 1, 2, 2, but you have 500 different categories. That would be more informative. Right? So, yeah.
What happens to all the animals?
No,
Well,
the 99% that are gone.
yeah, I know, right, yeah. What we have right now is less than 1% of what has existed, right? So I don't know. I mean, in the LDS tradition, there's some thoughts from Joseph Smith saying that they also have spirits of sorts and that they will somehow be resurrected and worlds without number will have that biological diversity at some point. But, at some point it's like, you mean every bacteria, every virus, every worm, every nematode, who needs nematodes? Okay? We need nematodes. I'm just joking. People always ask me, who needs mosquitoes, right?
Yeah.
But no, I don't know. I mean, all I know is that for me, I always show this picture in my class where I'm standing in Peru and there's just bugs all around me. We have this big bright light attracting hundreds and thousands of bugs around me. And I always say, I'm assuming that's what heaven's gonna be like. It's just you're standing and there's just bugs everywhere. So I don't know, maybe that's my heaven. different from
An
animals.
inordinate fondness for beetles.
Right, right. God like
I'd be
beetles.
disappointed if our dog doesn't come there.
Yeah, I don't know. Dogs are pretty cool. So.
Going back to like categorizations, so I think some people would consider themselves a skeptical theist, where it's sort of like atheism to agnosticism, but from the theistic side,
Mhm.
where they are like skeptical of their ability to discern why God does things, or whether things are a particular way. Do you think that's a useful labor?
I think that's fine. I find myself doing that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my wife would say, "You're too skeptical." That's what she would say. You're being too skeptical. Okay, any other questions? That was an interesting one. I went very different pathways. It was interesting.
I thought when she was asking about animals and stuff, it was referring to Noah.
Oh.
The next slide.
We don't need to talk about that. Anything else? Okay, I do have these other questions that come up every once in a while that are silly, but people sometimes, in the LDS tradition, there's this issue of death before the fall. And obviously there was death before the fall. I think the way that you think about that, if you want to take it literally, it has to only mean that there was, that the death that occurred at the fall was the separation of God from Adam and Eve. Not physical death. There was clearly physical death. There was clearly extinction. I mean, this is a silly notion that there was no death. But that's something I grew up thinking, that there was no death. Old Earth, obviously the Earth is really old. It's not less than 10,000 years old. If you want me to stop on these, I'm happy to. Again, the flood in the Ark, obviously, also it was not a global flood with one boat that carried all of the organisms, terrestrial organisms, freshwater and terrestrial organisms. That couldn't have happened. So again, you have to have other ways of dealing with those stories. You either say it's symbolic and allegorical, or you have to then go, all right, this is everything we know about science. How can I reconcile it? Just like I did with Adam and Eve. If you want to be literal, then you have to make it fit in light of all of the emergent truth from science. It's not okay to just throw out all of science and say, well, that's wrong. Yeah.
With the ark, shape of the ark, know any more information about that, or what's your
He was just telling me a story where he knows like the exact measurements.
yeah.
I used to know the exact measurements, but it's real clear that if you went by those exact measurements, you could have fit one brontosaurus inside of the ark. Not to mention all the other, large-bodied species that existed in the history of life, so that just doesn't work.
That's why
The other thing is that,
Dinosaurs didn't fit
yeah.
on the ark.
Not according to Hjelman, because there was no extinction. But the other thing is that Hebrew scholars all agree that the Ark story predates their culture. It originates in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, and it's basically a retelling in the context of Hebrew culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh comes from, I think it was the Sumerians.
So it's a generational
Yeah.
story.
Not just that, floods happen.
I was gonna say, it was a big flood.
Floods happen. You're right now where we're sitting was underwater not too many thousand years ago. And then a landform bridge broke and it drained. And there was a huge flood that happened when that drainage occurred. And there are stories of the native peoples of that area that talk about these kinds of floods. And so, of course, floods happen. And of course, you're going to create stories about these things on how it would have happened. And it's not too weird to think that someone would have created, a story eventually about a boat. And you got to save the animals and your family. But clearly, there was never a global flood that went all the way up to the top of the mountain.
I guess, yeah, since it's kind of based kind of regionally, I guess you could maybe interpret when said the Bible was written, that it was, sure they had the dimensions of the boat, but it's sure it could have fit all the animals from that.
Yeah, that's the best reconciliation if you're going to take a literal reading, is you have to just say, well, it wasn't global. It was just a local flood. There was a boat. They got some animals on it. It floated for a while, and then the flood receded and they went. Right? That could be okay, and it could still reconcile with the rest of scientific knowledge that we have about water bodies on this earth. That last one's silly. That's another LDS. You ever heard of that one?
I don't know that.
In the LDS tradition, the way that they explain fossils is that our world is made up of pieces of other worlds that came together. It's actually LDS tradition borrowing from creationists, though. It wasn't born out of the LDS tradition. It was born out of creationists. And a leader from the LDS tradition borrowed that from a different.
So they didn't use this word more like catastrophism.
Right, yeah, it's kind of catastrophism.
Catastrophe.
Anything else you guys want to talk about? Yeah.
At least anecdotally, I felt like there's a lot less apologetics among, like, I grew up LDS.
Mhm.
I don't know, like, did you discuss apologetics on your YouTube channel, or do you have places you could direct me or talk about it after?
I haven't addressed them specifically on my YouTube channel. I would love to. That would be a good thing that we could maybe develop together if you'd like to. But I think that apologetics might serve a function that could be positive, but they also are sometimes they cause a lot of damage. Because once again, they're setting people up on this ledge, and then all of a sudden more evidence comes out, and the ledge gets taken out from underneath them, and then that person falls. Because essentially apologetics sometimes lean on the mindset of the God of the gaps argument. And so I think that's a dangerous place to be. But some apologetic work, I think, has done some good. Yeah.
That makes sense. I haven't heard of that before, but so would you describe your, I mean, you called it gymnastics, but would you describe that as apologetics, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's kind of an apologetics approach. Yeah. Wasn't that fun? Thank you for sticking around. How long did we go? An hour and a half. All right, thanks for coming. All right, and my office. And thanks to Dr. Graves, Steve Nichols, and Carl, thank you.